You can learn any word, whether it's simple or complicated, in a new language. But the fact that you have memorized that word doesn't mean that you can then go and use it naturally in conversation when you're speaking another language. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Story Learning podcast. Great to have you here. I hope you've been enjoying the episodes recently. I've been getting some really interesting comments and feedback in general, especially on YouTube from these podcasts. But it's great to see everyone engaging and all of that. So welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be revisiting a topic that I feel most likely we're going to be talking about until the end of time. Literally, like the sun is going to become, over time the sun's going to expand to be bigger than, go beyond the earth, right? And we're all going to be frazzled up like a sausage. I'm going to be sitting there until the end talking about this topic, which is flashcards. Flashcards for language learning. And let me frame it by reading this question from Bing S5X, who says, "Man," you know this is where it gets serious, right? Because the comment starts with man. "Man, I've been using Anki for so long that I think if I stop, I'm not going to learn any more words. How can I gradually stop doing Anki and start doing more extensive reading? It's like I'm addicted to Anki, and I think if I only do extensive reading, I'm not going to learn any more words. Someone please help me." And I think this beautifully sums up the issue with flashcards. Okay, now, Bing S5X here is talking about Anki in particular. In case you don't know, it's like the most popular software for electronic flashcards. I personally have never found it easy to use, but loads of people love it. It doesn't really matter what software you use, what app you use, but the point is basically that you create flashcards on an app, and then they use what's called spaced repetition to show you more often the words that you haven't learned yet and show you less often the words that you have. So you spend your time focused on just learning the things that you need to focus on, right? So in theory, it's very, very efficient. And I think we're naturally drawn towards this kind of approach to language learning because it kind of makes intuitive sense. Because when we were at school, we were told that what we have to do to learn a language is memorize a bunch of vocabulary. And certainly when I was at school, what happened was we got given lists of, here are 10 French words, go and learn them by next Tuesday. So I did, and it worked to the extent that I remembered some of those words, and I would pass my test, and okay, everyone's happy, right? And it's true that in large part, the task of language learning is a task of learning an absolute shed load of vocabulary. If I were to pick one thing, one activity, one achievement that I could do in the early stages of language learning, it would be to learn as many words as possible, because with a lot of words you can say a lot of things, even if your grammar is all over the shop. Right? So it is true that vocabulary is key, and so it makes intuitive sense for us that flashcards are a good use of time, because then you're spending lots of time learning vocabulary, and that's always a good thing, right? Like, you're never going to learn more words and think, oh, I completely wasted my time. And so why is it that someone like Bing S5X, who's clearly who's clearly an experienced language learner, can spend so long using flashcards for vocabulary that he gets to a point where he feels, I'm addicted, and I feel like if I don't do this, I'm not going to learn any more. And I think the sentiment that's coming through here is one of just, and I'm reading between the lines here, but I get the feeling that the sentiment that's coming through is one of kind of emptiness. It's a lot of rote, mechanical drilling, and the acquiring of vocabulary as if it's like point notches on a scoreboard or something. Put it this way, he wouldn't be leaving this comment if it was proving to be a very effective, rewarding, satisfying way of learning, right? And but I recognize this because I used to be a big proponent of flashcards, and I have found in general that for more distant languages, flashcards become more useful, right? So for languages like Cantonese and Japanese, I've made a lot more use of flashcards because the vocabulary is so different from English and so little to hold on to, that I found flashcards to really be the only way that I can sink my teeth into it and have some kind of hooks, handholds, if you like, to try and remember that vocabulary. But then when it comes to languages that are closer to English, like Italian, or I've almost had no need to use flashcards at all because there are other ways of doing it, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. So I have used flashcards a lot. And I think the fundamental criticism of flashcards is as follows. If you are just learning words and rote memorizing words, you are not then learning how to use them. So you can learn any word, whether it's simple or complicated, in a new language. But the fact that you know you have memorized that word doesn't mean that you can then go and use it naturally in conversation when you're speaking another language. So often, I think when people express this frustration of, oh, I just don't sound natural when I'm speaking, it's like, yeah, a big part of that is because you're just trying to kind of cobble together words and you haven't been focusing on the glue around those words, right? And so this brings us to the kind of opposite viewpoint of flashcards, which is as follows. The opposite perspective on flashcards would be to say, instead of sitting down and trying to rote memorize as many words as I can, which could potentially end up in you being able to recall tons and tons of words, but not actually know how to use them properly and not sounding fluent when you speak, etc., etc. The opposite viewpoint would be to spend as much time as possible immersed in the language through comprehensible input, meaning language that you're able to understand. Because then what's going to happen is you're going to get natural exposure to those same words, to that same vocabulary, because it's going to keep coming back in the content that you're listening to. But more than that, what's going to happen is you're going to learn those words in context, which means not only are you going to get used to understanding things that you're reading or listening to, but when it comes time to use that vocabulary yourself, you're going to be much better placed to actually use it naturally and to speak naturally because you've been surrounded by that stuff the whole time. I mean, just think of it in these terms. Let's say you spend an hour a day on flashcards versus an hour a day reading a book of short stories, for example. Think for a second about the quantity of language that you're exposed to. How many words do you think you could possibly learn in flashcards in a 1 hour session? Like 20, 30 maybe? And now let's think that you read for an hour or you listen for an hour. How many words are you exposed to? Thousands. And so you add this up over days, weeks, months, years. Who's going to come out on top here? The person who's just been mechanically drilling like 10, 20 words a day, or the person who's been reading thousands and thousands of words a week for months on end? Like it should be obvious that the person who is immersed in the language through reading and listening is going to have a much more holistic, strong grasp of the language. Like that really shouldn't be a big stretch. And the reason this is so important is because there is so much to learn in a language. I think people chronically underestimate just how much there is to learn. Yes, it's true to say that vocabulary probably is the single most important thing to focus on. But then even once you've learned all that vocabulary, to get to a point where you can then speak that language with nuance, with idiosyncrasies, with confidence, in the same way as a native speaker might, that's a whole other set of skills and things that you need to learn, right? The major thing you've got to contend with when it comes to vocabulary, learning vocabulary with flashcards, is great, do flashcards by all means, but where else are you going to get that huge volume of exposure that's required in order to really, really get to grips with the language? So what do the experts say about this? Well, there's an interesting paper by Gianfranco Conti, who wrote a paper called What Really Matters in Vocabulary Acquisition, a ranked analysis of key influencing factors. So here he's looking at, if the goal is to learn vocabulary, which is ostensibly what you're doing when you're using flashcards, right? What actually matters? What actually affects your ability? What affects the outcome? What results in you having learned vocabulary eventually? And the stuff that he found was frequency of exposure, high quality instruction, time on task, and deep, meaningful engagement with vocabulary. All right? So let's just look at these one by one. So frequency of exposure is how often are you seeing those vocabulary items. Right? If you see a new word once, you ain't going to remember it. If you see it 10 times, you're far more likely to remember it, right? And this is what flashcards are very, very good at. They make you look at that vocabulary often. Next is high quality instruction. This, I think, like through a teacher's lens, kind of makes sense. I personally don't think this is necessary. I think you can learn a lot of vocabulary without high quality instruction. We might want to replace that with high quality materials, maybe, or good fit materials. Often I think it's funny, like teachers I think can often assume that without the teacher the student is lost, but I think that's just a certain type of student. Self-directed learners tend to do very well without instruction, I think. Anyway, let's not open that can of worms just yet. Next will be time on task, and so this is classroom language for how much time you're actually spending doing the thing. Right? Is it 5 minutes a day or an hour a day? That makes a huge difference. But it's this last one that really matters, right? Which is deep, meaningful engagement with vocabulary. And it should be obvious that when you're using flashcards, even if you're putting full sentences and rich context on those flashcards, this is not deep, meaningful engagement with vocabulary, right? So it's just not. Deep, meaningful engagement with vocabulary is reading stories. It is listening to stuff. It is using that vocabulary in conversations with a tutor or a teacher or a friend. Like, that's deep, meaningful engagement. Maybe even exploring the vocabulary, using AI to create personalized examples, whatever it may be. So the thing with flashcards is that, like, you can't get around the fact that it doesn't give you this deep, meaningful interaction. So at best, you might think of it as a stepping stone, perhaps. Like, okay, well, can I spend a certain amount of time just cramming flashcards? Cramming vocabulary with flashcards, and then I'll go off and read and listen and use it and all of that. And I think that there's something to that, but it's just in general, using the principle of directness. I tend to think that if you know that something is better for you anyway, if you know that there is a better, more holistic way of doing something, you're better off just doing that from the start. Start by doing the thing that you actually want to achieve. So that's all very well, but then there's one big hairy objection to the input-based approach, like reading and listening, which is that, okay, how do you get the frequency of exposure? Because the thing with flashcards is that if you're using flashcards in a targeted way, you are getting the vocabulary that you don't know yet, or that you're still trying to learn, presented to you over and over again at regular intervals. That's efficient. I'll give you that. It's very efficient, and that's why flashcards are useful. If you start reading stories or in the news or listening to podcasts instead, on the face of it, you lose that frequency of repetition, right? Because you might learn a new word, but then you might not come across that word again for 6 months, by which time you've forgotten it, right? So how do you get that frequency of exposure? And this is where the kind of meta skill of understanding what materials are best really comes in, okay? There are some principles here that we can use to make sure that when we are following an input-based approach, we get that repetition. Okay? Now, the first thing is to use shorter, contained, graded material that's suitable for your level. Right? So don't go and pick up War and Peace. Don't turn on the evening news. Find something instead which is short enough to be manageable. For example, a TV show episode rather than an entire movie. A book of short stories rather than War and Peace. And then read around that same topic. So if you're reading, I don't know, let's say that you're reading, what would be a good example here? Let's say that you're reading history books on the Second World War, and you're doing that in Italian. Okay, great. The effective thing to do would be to continue to read around that topic. So rather than reading about history one week and then space travel the next week and then language learning the week after, keep reading around that topic. So if you're reading about the Blitz, for example, can you go and find different books on that topic, YouTube videos on that topic, different resources on that same topic? Keep reading around the topic, because what happens there is that same vocabulary will come back again and again and again, and that's where you get that frequency, okay? Except it's happening naturally now. The other thing is to develop the ability to actually read and reread the same stuff over and over again. Now, in the front matter of my short story books, I've said this a few times, one of the things that I often get people emailing me about saying, I really liked this certain thing, was the 6-step reading process. And as part of that, what I say is that once you finish reading through a chapter of a story, what do? Do you go on and read the next one? No, you go back and read that chapter again and again, as many times as you can stomach, because when you go back and read something again, you get repeated exposure, and this is where the frequency comes up, and this is where you're then more likely to actually remember something. So from a combination of using graded material, reading around a topic, and then actually reading and rereading stuff, this is the way that you can get yourself that repeated exposure to the point where you really don't need to use flashcards anymore because you're just encountering the same vocabulary over and over again. The difference is that because you're using the whole language rather than just a flashcard, you're also getting hundreds and hundreds of other sources of input at the same time, which is ultimately over time going to compound and is going to make it so much easier for you. So to Bing 5SX's, S5X's question, if you're addicted to Anki and you can't stop, I think you've just got to replace that addiction with something else. And so what I would recommend is actually just spending some time finding that material that you really like. So if you're interested in the Blitz and you're learning Italian, well, go and find a bunch of stuff. Spend some time finding like 10, 15, 20 resources in Italian on that topic, and then bring those resources together in one place and just start using that. Read around your interests, listen around your interests, and then try to develop the habit of repeating stuff, giving material 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds of attention. I think if you've been using flashcards this whole time, I think you're really going to find that something magical starts to click when you start to do all this stuff more extensively. So those are my thoughts on the topic. Like I said, I don't use flashcards anymore, with one exception. I actually find flashcards quite useful just for recording vocabulary. So if I come across a new word and I want to remember it, I tend to actually stick it in my flashcards simply as a way to remember it for later. Oh yeah, I'm going to come back and look at this word later. I don't actually practice them on the flashcards at all. I just find it quite a useful place to actually capture vocabulary items that I want to remember. Now, one of the things from the Conti paper that we mentioned earlier was deep, meaningful engagement with vocabulary, and I have something that can help you with this, which is a grammar and vocabulary study sheet. It's free. You can print this off, as many copies as you want. And what this is for is this is a space where you can write down interesting phrases that you come across as you are reading and listening. And what this does is, so the idea here is not that you write down every new word, but when you come across something and you think to yourself, oh, I really want to learn this word, or I really want to learn this phrase, it gives you a few different ways to actually record that. It helps you be selective about choosing what words and phrases you want to remember. It puts the focus on capturing the entire phrase rather than the individual vocabulary item, and it just gives you a way to intentionally go a bit deeper with that vocabulary that you actually want to learn. There's another one of my incredible naming achievements, the grammar and vocabulary study sheet. I really think I should win a Nobel Prize for that naming. Anyway, you can get that free. Link will be in the description, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the StoryLearning podcast.